In this video, we'll discover what really lies beneath the ocean's surface. Why ancient sources spoke of a great island that vanished in a single night, and how an entire civilization could have sunk without a trace. We'll explore the history of Atlantis, from its first mentions in Plato to the strange coincidences that still haunt researchers today. You'll see what this city was like, with its rings of canals, temples, and riches, and learn why its inhabitants believed their world would last forever. But most importantly, we'll try to understand exactly what happened on that day, when the earth began to shift, and the ocean took everything back. And if this story isn't just a myth, then perhaps right now, beneath the water's surface, the ruins of what was once called Atlantis still lie. The story of Atlantis does not begin in the ocean. It doesn't begin with an expedition, or a discovery, or a moment when someone pulled something impossible from the seafloor and held it up to the light. It begins the way all old things begin, with someone telling someone else. A word passed between people in a room, a detail held carefully in memory and carried across a journey, a story repeated at a fire, at a table, in a temple, not because anyone ordered it preserved, but because something in it refused to be let go. That's where Atlantis starts. Not with evidence, with transmission. And what's remarkable, what tends to get lost when people jump straight to the dramatic part, is just how long that chain of transmission actually was before anyone wrote a single word of it down. By the time Plato recorded the story, it had already traveled across generations, across languages, across at least 2 distinct cultures. It had passed through the hands of priests and lawmakers and philosophers. It had survived in a form that was, by any measure, remarkably detailed for something so old. That detail is either the most compelling thing about the Atlantis story, or the most suspicious, depending on how you look at it. We'll get to that. But first, let's start at the beginning of the chain. The name most people associate with Atlantis is Plato. But Plato himself would have told you he was not the source. The source, he said, was a man named Solon. Solon lived roughly a century and a half before Plato, around 638 to 558 BCE. He was one of the most respected figures in Athenian history. Not a philosopher in the abstract sense. Not someone who spent his days debating ideas in the shade. Solon was a lawgiver, a statesman, a practical man, in the way that the most impressive people of the ancient world often were. Someone who understood power and justice not as theoretical concepts, but as things you had to build and maintain in the real world, against real opposition. Athens, in Solon's time, was a city in serious trouble. Economic inequality had reached a breaking point. Debt had reduced many ordinary Athenians to something close to serfdom. The social fabric was tearing, and Solon was the person the city turned to. Given extraordinary authority to reform its laws, cancel its debts, and rebuild something more stable from the wreckage. He did it, imperfectly, with compromises that satisfied no one entirely. But he did it. And then, crucially, unusually, he stepped back from the power he'd been given, rather than holding on to it. By ancient standards, this made him extraordinary. A man who could have made himself a tyrant and chose not to. It was after this period, after the reforms, after the politics, that Solon left Athens. He traveled, spending time in several parts of the Mediterranean world, and at some point during those travels, he went to Egypt. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Egypt meant to the ancient Greek mind. Greece in Solon's time was a relatively young civilization. Its written history stretched back a few centuries. Its mythology reached further, but mythology and history were understood to be different things. Even then, Egypt was something else entirely. Egyptian civilization had been continuous, in recognizable form, for over 2,000 years before Solon was born. Its monuments, the pyramids at Giza, the temples along the Nile, were already ancient by the time Greek culture was finding its footing. The priests who maintained those temples kept records that went back to a depth that Greek scholars found almost incomprehensible. For a thoughtful Greek traveler in the ancient world, visiting Egypt was something like what visiting the most remote and well-preserved archives in the world might feel like today. You went there to understand what you didn't know, to find the older version of the story, to locate yourself in a timeline that extended much further back than your own culture's memory. Solon, apparently, was that kind of traveler. According to the account Plato later recorded, Solon spent time in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, a city with particular connections to the goddess Neith, who the Greeks associated with Athena. The priests there seem to have welcomed him, or at least engaged with him seriously. And at some point in those conversations, one of the priests said something that stopped him. He told Solon that the Greeks were, in a sense, children, not as an insult. He explained what he meant, that the Greek world had been repeatedly disrupted by catastrophes, floods, droughts, disasters that wiped out populations and broke the thread of cultural memory. Each time this happened, the survivors started again from scratch. They remembered only what had occurred since the last catastrophe. Everything before it was lost. Egypt, the priest said, had been spared the worst of these disruptions. Its geography protected it. The Nile flooded on a cycle, predictably, bringing life rather than destruction. And so its records survived. Its memory was longer. And in that longer memory, there were stories that the Greeks no longer knew. One of those stories was about an island. A great island, the priests said, larger than Libya and Asia combined. That phrase, in Greek terms, essentially meant bigger than the known world. It sat beyond the Pillars of Hercules, at the edge of the ocean that no Greek sailor had reason to cross. And on that island was a civilization. Powerful, organized, sophisticated in ways that the ancient world, even at its best, rarely managed. The Atlanteans, as they would later be called, had extended their influence across the sea. They controlled territory in the western Mediterranean. They had, at their height, threatened the peoples of Europe and the coastlands of Africa. The priest described them as a conquering force that had pressed as far as Egypt and Greece before being stopped. And here the story takes a turn that even the Egyptian priests seem to have told with a kind of gravity, because the Atlanteans were stopped, not by a rival empire, not by a coalition of armies, but by something older and larger than any human force. In a single day and night, the earth shook, the water rose, and the island, the people, the buildings, the roads, the temples, everything was swallowed, gone. The sea above where it had stood became, the priests said, impassable. Shallow and treacherous, filled with silt and debris, unable to be crossed by any ship. It was as if the ocean itself had sealed the wound. Solon, by all accounts, was affected by this. He wrote about it, or rather, he began to write about it. The plan was apparently to turn the story into an epic poem, something that could hold its full weight and convey it to Greek audiences in a form they would understand and remember. He never finished it. We don't know exactly why. Solon was old by the time he traveled, already in the later chapters of a life that had been extraordinarily full. The poem may simply have been left incomplete because time ran out. Or perhaps the story was, as Plato suggests with his characteristic obliqueness, resistant to final form, as if it knew it wasn't finished yet. What Solon left behind were notes, fragments, enough for the story to survive in his family, passed from him to his relatives, carried forward not as a public text, but as something private, something the family held. And eventually it reached Plato. Plato was not a casual writer. He was one of the most deliberate and sophisticated thinkers of the ancient world, and everything he committed to text was committed on purpose. He didn't include things accidentally. He didn't pad his dialogues with material he didn't believe served his larger argument. So when Plato sat down to write about Atlantis, in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, the question worth asking first is, what was he trying to do? Timaeus is primarily a dialogue about the nature of the universe. It's a dense, ambitious text that covers cosmology, the structure of reality, the nature of time. Atlantis appears in it almost as a preamble, a story told at the opening to establish context for a larger discussion about what Athens represents in the history of civilization. Critias goes much deeper into Atlantis itself. It describes the island in detail that even today reads as startlingly specific. Not the vague, dreamy geography of myth, but precise geometry, exact measurements, named kings, described laws. The island, Plato writes, was shaped in a way that suggested deliberate, almost mathematical design. At its center was a hill, and on that hill, a palace, the original dwelling of Poseidon himself. Around the hill, the god had created rings of alternating land and water. First a ring of sea, then a ring of land, then another ring of sea, then land again. 3 rings of water, 2 of land, nested like circles on a target, extending outward from the central hill. These rings were connected by tunnels large enough for ships to pass through. The outermost ring of sea was connected to the open ocean by a great canal. The whole structure was, in effect, a city built like a fortress, but also like a work of art, something that declared, by its very form, the power and sophistication of the people who made it. The dimensions Plato gives are extraordinary. The outer ring of water was 3 stades wide, roughly 550 meters. The canal connecting the city to the ocean was 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep. The great plain that surrounded the city was 3,000 stades long and 2,000 stades wide, an area larger than most modern countries. Whether you believe any of this happened or not, it's worth pausing on the strangeness of this level of detail in a fictional text from 360 BCE. Plato was not writing fantasy. He was writing in a tradition of careful, reasoned argument, and he attached to this story measurements so specific they could, in theory, be verified. That's either the mark of someone recording something real, or someone making an unusually sophisticated rhetorical choice to make their allegory feel real. Both options are interesting. Plato also gives us the origin of the Atlantean civilization in a form that reads like compressed mythology. Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived on the central hill. He enclosed the hill with rings of sea and land to protect her, and from their union were born 5 pairs of male twins, 10 sons, who became the first kings of Atlantis. The eldest son, named Atlas, inherited the central island and the largest share of power. The others were given territories across the island and the surrounding region. This is, by Plato's account, why the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules came to be called the Atlantic, named for Atlas, the first king. The 10 kings ruled together under a system of laws that Poseidon himself had laid down. Every 5 years, alternating between 5 and 6, to honor both odd and even numbers equally, the kings gathered in the central temple. They hunted a bull together, sacrificed it, and renewed their oaths to each other and to the law. The law itself was inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum, a metal Plato describes as the most precious substance on earth aside from gold, red gleaming, and mined abundantly in Atlantis, in the innermost sanctuary of Poseidon's temple. What they swore each time was essentially this: that they would not take up arms against each other. That power would not be allowed to accumulate in any single pair of hands. That the Confederation would hold. It held, Plato says, for many generations. The Atlantis that Plato describes in Critias is not a primitive or mythological place. It reads, and this is what has fascinated people for centuries, like a functioning civilization. The capital city had a working harbor system. The canals were engineered to move both ships and water. The bridges were built with structures to allow passage underneath. There were hot and cold springs. Plato specifically mentions both, with separate bathing facilities for different uses. There were horse racing tracks. There were gymnasia. There were separate districts for different classes of residents. The Temple of Poseidon was plated in silver on the outside, with pinnacles of gold. The interior ceiling was ivory, set with gold and silver and orichalcum. Statues of gold stood throughout, including a central image of Poseidon himself, standing in a chariot so tall that his head touched the ceiling, surrounded by 100 nereids on dolphins. Outside the city, the great plain was cultivated with extraordinary organization. It was divided into plots. There was a system of irrigation channels. Every plot was required to supply a certain number of soldiers and provisions to the common defense. Calculated precisely. The whole thing reads like a city that someone planned. not one that grew organically. A city that was, in some sense, too rational to be real, unless it was. All of this, the engineering, the abundance, the carefully balanced power, the law inscribed in precious metal, began to erode. Plato's account of the fall is brief, but devastating in its clarity. For many generations, he writes, the Atlanteans carried the divine nature they had inherited from Poseidon. They valued virtue more than wealth. They bore prosperity without arrogance. They could see clearly enough to recognize that wealth was in service to life, not the other way around. But the divine part faded. The human part, with all its hungers, grew stronger. And when that happened, to anyone watching from outside, the Atlanteans would have still seemed fine, still wealthy, still powerful, still impressive by every external measure. Only someone looking very carefully at their behavior toward each other, at how they spent their resources, at what they chose to care about, would have seen that something essential had changed. Zeus saw it. Plato's text breaks off here. Critias ends mid-sentence, in the middle of Zeus addressing the assembled gods about what should be done. Whether Plato never finished the dialogue, or whether the ending was lost sometime in the centuries of copying and transmission, no one knows. What we know from Timaeus is the conclusion. One day and night of violent catastrophe. The island gone, the sea above it, shallow and unpassable. And after that, silence. Here is the situation we are actually in, if we're being precise about it. We have two dialogues, one unfinished, written by a Greek philosopher in the 4th century BCE. Those dialogues describe a civilization that supposedly existed 9,000 years earlier. Information preserved by Egyptian priests who claimed their records went back that far, passed to a Greek statesman who carried it home but never published it, and finally written down by Plato for reasons that scholars still debate. That is the entire primary source for Atlantis. There is no independent corroboration, no Egyptian record of this conversation with Solon, no other Greek source that mentions Atlantis as a real place, no artifact, no ruin, no physical evidence of any kind that has been definitively linked to what Plato described. And yet, the story persists. It has persisted for over 2,000 years. It has survived the rise and fall of empires, the loss of entire civilizations, the radical transformation of human knowledge. It has survived every attempt to definitively dismiss it, and every failure to definitively locate it. That's not proof of anything. Persistence alone doesn't make a story true. But it does make you want to ask, why this one? Why does this story, specifically, refuse to close? Part of the answer is in the detail. The measurements, the kings, the engineering, the laws. A purely allegorical story doesn't need all of that. Plato could have made his philosophical point with a much simpler tale. The elaboration suggests either that he was drawing on something, some older account, some real tradition, or that he was playing a very long game with his readers, constructing a false document convincing enough to be mistaken for a real one for millennia. Either interpretation is extraordinary, and either way, the story is still here, passed down from one person to another, across centuries, across cities, across cultures that have long since vanished. Just like it always has been, there's a moment in every story about power when ambition stops being a virtue. When the thing that made a civilization great, the drive, the energy, the refusal to accept limits, curdles into something else, something that can't be satisfied, something that looks outward and sees not neighbors, but territory. That moment in the story of Atlantis is where this chapter begins. Because the priests who spoke to Solon in Egypt didn't just describe an island. They described what that island became, what it did with its power, how it moved across the world, slowly at first, then faster, then with a kind of momentum that started to look unstoppable. And they described what happened when it finally met something it couldn't move. It's worth saying clearly, Atlantis didn't start as a conquering force. That's not how these things begin. They never do. In Plato's account, the early Atlanteans were a people who had everything they needed and understood, at least for a while, that this was enough. The island was extraordinarily rich. It produced timber and metals and food in abundance. The surrounding sea gave them fish. The land gave them crops. The mountains gave them stone for building. And so in those early generations, the ones still close enough to Poseidon's founding that the divine inheritance hadn't yet faded, the Atlanteans weren't hungry for more. They were genuinely content, not in a passive, incurious way. They built, they engineered, they created systems of extraordinary sophistication. But the energy behind all of that was pride in craft, pride in order, pride in what they had made, not a restless need to acquire what belonged to someone else. Trade came first, as it always does. Atlantean ships began to appear at foreign ports, not as warships, but as merchant vessels. They carried metals that other cultures didn't have access to. Orichalcum, that strange red gleaming alloy that Plato describes as nearly as precious as gold, showed up in markets across the ancient world. Atlantean fabrics, Atlantean timber, Atlantean craftsmanship. All of it moved through networks of exchange that spread the civilization's influence without requiring a single soldier. This is how soft power works, and the Atlanteans, whether they knew it or not, were practicing it. But soft power has a way of hardening. When your goods are in someone else's market, you have an interest in that market remaining stable. When your ships use someone else's harbor, you have an interest in that harbor remaining open. When your traders live in someone else's city, you have an interest in the laws of that city remaining favorable. And at some point, gradually, then all at once, those interests start to feel like rights. The priests told Solon that by the time Atlantis began to move outward in a more deliberate way, it had already built something that most civilizations of the ancient world could only dream of. A stable, organized, well-supplied military machine. The Critias gives us a glimpse of what this looked like. The great plain surrounding the capital city was divided into plots, each one responsible for supplying a fixed number of soldiers, horses, chariots, and ships to the common defense. The numbers Plato records are almost absurdly large. Tens of thousands of chariots, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But even allowing for ancient exaggeration, the picture is of a civilization that had industrialized the business of war in a way that most of its contemporaries hadn't. And they used it. Parts of Libya, the priests said. Parts of Europe. Territory after territory along the shores of the Mediterranean and beyond. All of it gradually brought under Atlantean influence. Some of it probably through trade agreements and political pressure rather than outright conquest. But influence is influence, however it arrives. And under Atlantis, it arrived everywhere. The world, for a time, was reorganizing itself around this one center of power. And still it wasn't enough, because there came a point when the Atlanteans looked east, toward the Mediterranean, toward the ancient lands that the Greeks and Egyptians considered the heart of the civilized world, and decided that what they had was still not complete. They began to move toward Egypt. They began to move toward Greece. This is the part of the story that tends to get less attention than it deserves. Most people, when they think about Atlantis, think about the island itself. The rings of water, the temple, the cataclysm. They don't think much about Athens. But in Plato's account, Athens is essential. It's arguably the whole point. The Athens he describes, though, is not the Athens of the Parthenon and Socrates and the golden age of Greek democracy. It is something much older, a city so ancient that no living Athenian in Plato's time had any real memory of it. A city that existed, in Plato's telling, 9,000 years before his own era. This ancient Athens was, if anything, even more virtuous than the Atlantis of its own early period. Where Atlantis had abundance, Athens had simplicity. Where Atlantis had vast wealth and elaborate systems of organization, Athens had something harder to build and harder to maintain. Genuine civic virtue. A people who understood that a city is only as strong as the shared values that hold it together. Who didn't need wealth to maintain their sense of who they were. Plato describes their society as governed by a class of guardians, something very close to the ideal he lays out in the Republic. Warriors who were also philosophers, people who served the community not for personal gain, but because service was simply what you did. A civilization built on the idea that power was a responsibility, not a privilege. The contrast with Atlantis, by the time the two civilizations met, could hardly have been sharper. One was the most powerful empire the ancient world had seen, wealthy beyond measure, militarily dominant, carrying the momentum of centuries of successful expansion. The other was a modest city on a rocky peninsula in the eastern Mediterranean, with none of Atlantis's resources and none of its reach. And yet, the confrontation, as the Egyptian priests described it to Solon, was not a quick, dramatic battle. It was a slow, grinding, existential test. Atlantis advanced, and Athens did not yield. Not city by city, not mile by mile, not in the incremental way that most resistance movements eventually collapse under sustained pressure. Athens held. It held in the way that things only hold when the people holding them genuinely believe in what they're defending. Not just their lives, not just their territory, but the idea behind their city, the principle of it, the belief that there was something worth protecting that had nothing to do with wealth or power, or the kind of strength that can be measured in ships and soldiers. Plato is careful about how he tells this part. He doesn't describe Athens winning through superior strategy, or greater numbers, or better weapons. He describes them winning through something harder to account for, a kind of moral endurance, a refusal that couldn't be negotiated or worn down because it wasn't based on calculation in the first place. Atlantis, for all its might, eventually found that it had pushed against something immovable, and it retreated. This is one of the most quietly radical things Plato embedded in the story. In a world that consistently rewarded size and force, where empire after empire had proven that enough military power, applied consistently enough, would eventually break any resistance, he inserted a story about a time when the opposite happened, when a smaller, poorer, less powerful civilization said no to an overwhelming force and made it stick. Whether that was meant as history or as argument, and almost certainly it was both, the point was unmistakable. Power alone is not decisive. Something else matters. Something that Atlantis, by the time it went to war with Athens, had already lost. And then the catastrophe came. But here's the detail that tends to get quietly forgotten in most retellings of the Atlantis story. It wasn't only Atlantis that was destroyed. The earthquakes and floods that the priests described didn't discriminate. In a single day and night, yes, Atlantis sank beneath the ocean. But that same catastrophe also consumed the ancient Athens that had resisted it. The city that had stood against the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen. It was gone, too, wiped out by the same forces that punished Atlantis. There were no victors, no civilization left standing to tell its own story. Just the silence after the catastrophe and the slow, amnesiac rebuilding of whatever came next. The Greeks who came after, the ones who built the Athens that history remembers, had no memory of any of this. Not because they chose to forget, but because the catastrophe had been thorough enough to break the thread entirely. They started again from nothing. They built new myths to explain where they came from and who they were. They had no idea that their predecessors had once stood against an empire and refused to break. It was only in Egypt, in temples that had survived what Greece had not, that the memory persisted. And it was only because Solon traveled to Egypt and a priest decided to tell him what was in those older records that any of it survived at all. It's easy to read the conflict between Athens and Atlantis as a simple morality tale. Good city versus bad empire. Virtue defeats power. Justice prevails. But Plato was too careful a thinker for simple morality tales. Look at the ending again. Athens wins. And then Athens is destroyed anyway, along with everything else. There is no triumph. There is no golden age that follows the defeat of Atlantis. There is only the erasure of everything that came before, and the long, slow, unconscious rebuilding that forgot it had ever happened. What Plato seems to be saying, and this is the part that resonates in ways that go beyond the story itself, is that the struggle between these two kinds of civilization is permanent. It doesn't end. The forces that built Atlantis, ambition, expansion, the slow replacement of virtue with appetite, those forces don't disappear just because one particular empire falls. They come back. They always come back. Different name, different geography, different era. And the thing that resisted Atlantis, that fragile, stubborn, resource-poor insistence on maintaining something worth defending, that has to be rebuilt too. Every generation. From scratch. Because catastrophe doesn't preserve it any more than it preserves anything else. This is not a comfortable reading of the story. It doesn't end with the good civilization winning and living happily ever after. But it might be an honest one. The priests finished their account. Solon listened. And somewhere in the exchange, in the stone hall, in the shadow of columns that had been standing for longer than Greek civilization had existed, something shifted in his understanding of the world. He had come to Egypt as a lawgiver, a man who had spent his life thinking about how to build a just society, how to structure laws so that they held, how to balance competing interests so that a city didn't tear itself apart. And in Egypt, he found a story that suggested all of that, all the careful work of civilization building, existed inside a larger pattern, one that repeated, one that didn't necessarily end well, regardless of how virtuous any particular civilization managed to be. He carried that home with him. He tried to write it down. He couldn't finish it. Maybe because some stories are too large to fit inside the form you've chosen for them. Maybe because the ending, the part where nobody wins, where even the victors are swallowed, was not the kind of thing you put into an epic poem meant to inspire. Or maybe because he understood, by the end, that the point of the story wasn't the ending. It was the resistance. The fact that something small and stubborn and committed to its own values had stood against something enormous and prevailed, even temporarily, even before the catastrophe swallowed them both, was the part that mattered. That was the part worth carrying across the sea. That was the part worth remembering. Even now, time does something strange to stories. The ones that matter, the ones that carry real weight, don't fade the way you'd expect. They change. They get filtered through new languages, new cultures, new sets of assumptions about what the world is and how it works. Details shift. Emphases move. The story that arrives in one century is not quite the same story that left the previous one, but the core of it persists. The thing at the center that made it worth carrying in the first place, that survives. Atlantis is the clearest example of this I know. By the time Plato wrote it down, the story had already traveled through centuries and across cultures. By the time the medieval world inherited Plato's texts, another 1,000 years had passed. By the time the modern world began seriously searching for physical evidence, another 1,000 years on top of that. And yet, here we are, still talking about it, still looking. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary when you think about it carefully. Most stories from the ancient world survive only in academic archives, studied by specialists, unknown to anyone outside a narrow field of scholarship. Atlantis is on the cover of magazines. It's the subject of documentaries. It generates serious scientific expeditions and wild fringe theories in roughly equal measure. And both kinds of people are, in their own way, genuinely gripped by it. Why? That's the question this chapter is really about. Not just where people have looked for Atlantis, but why they couldn't stop looking. What it is about this particular story that keeps pulling generation after generation back to the edge of the ocean, staring into the water, wondering. For a long time after Plato wrote about Atlantis, the story occupied a strange middle space in Western thought. It wasn't dismissed outright. Plato was too important a figure, too central to the entire intellectual tradition, for anything he wrote to be simply waved away. And yet it wasn't treated as straightforward history either. Most ancient scholars who engaged with the Atlantis passages in Timaeus and Critias seem to have understood them as philosophical allegory, a story designed to make a point, not a report designed to convey facts. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, reportedly said that Plato had invented the continent in order to destroy it, meaning that Atlantis was a literary device created specifically to be sunk, to illustrate what happens to civilizations that lose their way. Whether Aristotle actually said this, or said something that was later paraphrased into this neatness, is debated. But the attitude it represents was dominant for a long time. Then the world changed. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European sailors began crossing the Atlantic in earnest. They found continents that their maps had not predicted. They found civilizations, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, that were, by any measure, extraordinarily sophisticated. Civilizations that had built pyramids, developed calendars, created systems of writing, organized vast agricultural networks, and done all of it in complete isolation from the old world. The European mind, encountering all of this, reached instinctively for an explanation. Where did these people come from? How did they build these things? How could civilizations on opposite sides of an ocean have developed such striking similarities? The pyramids, the sun worship, the flood myths, without any contact between them? Atlantis offered an answer. A sunken bridge, a common ancestor, a lost civilization that had seeded both sides of the Atlantic before disappearing beneath it. It was wrong, as we now know. The similarities between Old and New World civilizations are the product of independent development, not a common Atlantean origin. Human beings, given similar challenges, tend to develop similar solutions. Pyramids are a natural consequence of building tall structures with primitive technology. They're stable, they're achievable. They don't require engineering insights that would be beyond a sophisticated pre-modern culture. But the instinct that reached for Atlantis in that moment was not foolish. It was the instinct of people trying to make sense of a world that had just become much larger and stranger than they'd thought. And it attached itself to the one story in their tradition that seemed to gesture toward exactly this kind of hidden, lost, world-connecting civilization. The person most responsible for turning Atlantis from a philosophical curiosity into a genuine popular obsession was an American politician named Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was not a work of careful scholarship. Donnelly was a passionate, energetic, somewhat credulous man who had a gift for synthesis, for pulling together disparate pieces of information and weaving them into a grand, unified theory. The theory, in this case, was that Atlantis had been real, that it had been located in the Atlantic Ocean, that it had been the cradle of all human civilization, and that its destruction was the event behind the flood myths found in cultures all over the world. The book was a sensation. It went through dozens of editions. It was read by people who had never thought about ancient history in their lives, and it made them feel that they were touching something real, something that academic institutions had either missed or were suppressing. Donnelly pointed to the similarities between Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramids. He noted the presence of flood narratives in cultures that had never been in contact. He found what he believed were linguistic echoes between old and new world languages, botanical evidence for transatlantic contact in pre-Columbian times, mythological figures that seemed to appear on both sides of the ocean. Some of his observations were genuinely interesting. Some were forced. Most of his conclusions outran his evidence by a considerable distance. But the overall effect of the book was to establish a framework that has persisted in various forms ever since. The idea that Atlantis was a real, advanced, technologically sophisticated civilization whose destruction sent survivors fleeing in all directions, carrying the seeds of what would become the great ancient civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and the Americas. This framework is not supported by the archaeological record, but it is remarkably resilient because it answers a question that the official record leaves uncomfortably open. How do you explain the apparent sophistication of ancient civilizations that, by conventional chronology, shouldn't have had time to develop what they developed? The answer that mainstream archaeology gives, that human beings are more capable than we tend to assume, and that complexity can emerge faster than we expect when conditions are right, is true. But it's not emotionally satisfying in the way that Donnelly's answer was. His answer had a story. It had a lost golden age. It had tragedy and survival, and a hidden thread connecting all of human history. Stories beat arguments almost every time. Once the modern search for Atlantis was underway in earnest, the candidates multiplied quickly. The Atlantic Ocean was the obvious first place to look. Plato had said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the open ocean. The ocean was vast, and until very recently, almost entirely unmapped. Anything could be down there. The discovery of the mid-Atlantic ridge in the 19th century briefly electrified Atlantis hunters. Here was a massive underwater mountain range running the length of the Atlantic. Clearly a significant geological feature. Some of its peaks broke the surface as islands. The Azores, Ascension, Tristan da Cunha. Were these the highest points of a sunken continent? The visible remnants of what had once been Atlantis? Geologists, unfortunately, said no. And not just no, but no in a way that was structurally definitive. The mid-Atlantic ridge is not a sunken continent. It is a divergent plate boundary, the place where two tectonic plates are pulling apart. And new oceanic crust is being created to fill the gap. The geology moves in the wrong direction entirely. Nothing sank there. The Atlantic seafloor has never been dry land in any time frame relevant to human history. So the search moved. The Mediterranean became the next serious candidate. And here the evidence was more interesting. The volcanic eruption that destroyed the island of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 BCE was genuinely catastrophic. 60 cubic kilometers of rock and ash ejected into the atmosphere. Tsunamis that devastated coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean. The effective end of the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. A sophisticated Bronze Age culture that, by the standards of its time, was extraordinarily advanced. The parallels with Atlantis are real and worth taking seriously. A prosperous island civilization, suddenly destroyed by geological forces, its influence felt across the ancient world. If you reduce Plato's timeline by a factor of 10, a plausible scribal error in ancient manuscripts, the dates align. If you understand the Minoan civilization as the model that filtered through generations of retelling and the transformation of oral tradition became Atlantis, the story makes coherent sense. This is, by academic standards, the most credible version of the Atlantis as real event hypothesis. Not a literal continent in the Atlantic, but a real disaster in the Aegean, remembered and transformed into something larger by the passage of time. Then there was the Bimini Road. In 1968, off the coast of North Bimini in the Bahamas, divers discovered what appeared to be a stretch of large, regularly shaped limestone blocks on the seafloor. The blocks were flat. They were arranged in a curved line. They looked, to some eyes, like a road, or a wall, or the foundation of something. The excitement was immediate and intense. Here, at last, was physical evidence of an ancient civilization beneath the Atlantic. This was Atlantis. Geologists and marine archaeologists looked at the Bimini Road carefully and reached a different conclusion. The blocks were natural, a phenomenon called beach rock, formed when sandy sediment is cemented together by calcium carbonate and then breaks along natural fracture lines. The regular shapes and the linear arrangement were the product of geology, not human hands. The discovery was real. The interpretation was not. This pattern, striking discovery, compelling initial reading, deflation upon closer examination, has repeated itself many times in the history of Atlantis hunting. It's not a conspiracy. It's just how human perception works. We are pattern recognition machines, and we are especially good at finding the patterns we're already looking for. The last few decades have transformed our ability to look. Sonar mapping now produces detailed three-dimensional images of the ocean floor. Underwater drones can dive to extreme depths and return high-resolution footage. Satellite imaging can detect subtle variations in the Earth's surface that would have been invisible to any previous generation. LiDAR, laser-based aerial scanning, has already revealed entire hidden cities beneath jungle canopies in Cambodia and Guatemala. Civilizations that the world didn't know existed until a few years ago. With all of this, the search for Atlantis has continued, and it has found things that are genuinely remarkable. Just not Atlantis. We now know that the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, caused sea levels to rise by as much as 120 meters in some areas. Vast stretches of what is now the continental shelf were once dry land. People lived there. They built things there. And when the seas rose, not overnight, but over centuries and generations, those places were flooded. We have found the evidence: submerged forests, ancient riverbeds, stone structures beneath the shallow waters off coastlines worldwide. In the North Sea, between Britain and continental Europe, there was once a landmass that archaeologists call Doggerland, a habitable, populated region the size of a small country, now lying beneath 40 meters of water. People lived in Doggerland. They hunted and fished there. They left behind tools and animal bones that trawling fishing boats occasionally pull up today. Doggerland is not Atlantis, but it is proof that the loss of inhabited land to rising seas is not myth. It is history. It happened within the time frame of human civilization. It would have been experienced as catastrophe by the people it displaced, and the memory of it could plausibly have survived in the stories those people carried with them. None of this confirms Plato's account, but it confirms that the world he was drawing on, a world where catastrophic loss of land and civilization was a real possibility, not just a philosophical conceit, was a world grounded in genuine human experience. Somewhere along the way, the search for Atlantis became something larger than archaeology. It became a mirror. Every generation that went looking found, in some sense, a reflection of its own preoccupations. In the colonial era, Atlantis was a common ancestor for all civilizations, a way of explaining the world's diversity without fully reckoning with independent human achievement. In the Cold War era, Atlantis became a lost golden age, a civilization destroyed by its own hubris, an obvious metaphor for a world living under the threat of nuclear annihilation. In the New Age movements of the 1970s and 80s, Atlantis became a source of hidden wisdom, a civilization of spiritual advancement that had passed its knowledge down through secret channels to the present day. Each version says more about the people searching than about the thing being searched for. And yet, underneath all of those layers, all the projection, all the wishful thinking, all the motivated reasoning, the original story is still there, intact, largely unchanged from what Plato wrote in the 4th century BCE. A civilization that was given everything, that lost what mattered, that reached too far, that fell. And somewhere beneath the water, in whatever form, in whatever location, the trace of it remains, not necessarily as ruins, maybe just as a question that refuses to close. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's exactly the right amount of answer for a story like this one.